is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Thursday's program, we start with a recent segment from the BCI Cattle Chat Podcast, where Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell give advice on starting in agriculture. In addition to that, K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts shares the positives of bats and the ecological benefits they provide agricultural land. K-State County Extension agents Jared Petersilie and Sandra Wick also provide this week's wheat harvest update. We end this Thursday's programming with this week's horticulture piece from Riley County Extension horticulture agent Gregg Eyestone. He discusses the challenges home gardeners are facing with this year's tomatoes. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're starting off today's programming with a segment from the weekly podcast known as the BCI Cattle Chat. This includes Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell.
We've talked about in the past getting into the beef industry, and there was a question from a listener, and I think this is a great question because all of us interact with students, right? Undergrad, high school, other, and they said, hey, why don't you guys broaden it out a little bit? And in this specific scenario, I didn't grow up on a farm or ranch. I like cattle, but I don't have any experience with cattle, and I feel like it's hard to get experience when I don't have any experience. So what would your advice be?
First off, now is a perfect time, I think, with the labor shortages in every single industry. If one wants to truly get into ag, I guess if thinking going back to either high school or a college student, there's a lot of opportunities at the university to get involved. That's through clubs, that's through the university farms, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for youth to get involved if that's truly what they want. And we're actually starting to see a lot more, at least in the ag econ department. I can't speak for others, but there's a lot of more and more students are coming from the urban, the larger areas. And they're obviously not coming from the ag background either, but they're getting involved and whatnot. And so I guess my thoughts are it's there if you want to. Just if you're young, if you're energetic, if you really have that desire, I think there's a lot of opportunities, not just within the university setting, but also outside the university setting with producers. As long as somebody's willing to learn, and that's exactly if that's what they think they want to do, they're willing to train and teach and work with them.
You can teach the cattle handling skills. You can teach some of the things that you need to know. You cannot teach enthusiasm for the subject.
Correct. Yeah. No, if you've got the determination, the motivation, having the experience growing up, it's nice, but on the other hand, I think, Bob, you said something earlier. Having a fresh set of eyes, I think, is what you said. That would be a strength that that the student might be able to bring to the table.
Working with veterinary students and undergraduate students that have an ag background that are used to cattle handling, some of the things you mentioned, Brad, just animal behavior, how to handle them, how to be safe around them, those are great advantages to have grown up around livestock or ag. But I also agree that there is a value of fresh eyes, just asking the questions, why do we do that way? And you can't have both of those advantages at the same time. You can't have fresh eyes and experience. So I would say to somebody that doesn't have the experience, well, lean into your advantage, which is the ability to ask good questions. Why do we do things this way? Is there a better way? My wife did not grow up around agriculture. She grew up in a suburban area, but became interested in ag before she met me. And it was fascinating being in practice with her because she asked better questions than I could come up with because she saw everything with fresh eyes. But there's some advantages to just coming in and asking the obvious questions sometimes.
But you've got to break through that barrier of, I might feel stupid. As teachers, we'll often say, there's no stupid questions. Well, sometimes there are. And I've asked them.
It feels that way.
I've asked them before, and you're like, oh, well, everybody else knew that? Okay, well, I didn't know it, or I wouldn't have asked the question. So that's what makes it not a stupid question. It may be something that everybody else knew, but I got to be willing to say, hey, I've got to be able to ask that and have somebody give me an answer, and then I won't have to ask again.
The other thing is you have to be willing to start slow. Everybody can run a shovel, and I know shovels are used pretty much everywhere. So it might be that you're doing weekend work on a farm just to kind of be around cattle, and maybe you move into start processing some cattle with a crew. There are ways, but it just depends on what your expectations are. If you go from absolutely no ag experience and you're trying to look for positions where you're managing feed. That's not a good transition. So you've got to find a way to work into it. And, Dustin said at the university, there's clubs and there's work experience on the university farms. Those are great. If this person isn't in their undergraduate education anymore, it might be weekend help at a local farm or ranch or feed yard or whatever. So I think you have to be willing to go in and work hard and be a whatever I got to do to get some more experience kind of deal.
Because I don't care if you're running a shovel or pulling weeds or doing something else. If you're enthusiastic to be there, that will be recognized, and you'll start to pick up skills because you'll be around others going through. And my shovel skills are not that good, Brian. Maybe you could come over. I got a little spot that you could come over and you could show me. I'll watch you work, and then I'll get better.
I'm thinking you need to just work on that yourself.
I thought Brian would be able to come help me and maybe show me a little bit more. And I do think jump in is our motto here, and jump in and figure it out. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. We can teach skills. We can't teach the enthusiasm. We can't teach the want to, the desire to get better. And I think there's a lot of operations that would be more than happy to have somebody come on board. And that's what you were saying, Dustin.
Yeah, no, basically something I've always lived by is if there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. If you have listener questions, you can certainly send us an email at bci@ksu.edu or contact us on Twitter.
Once again, that was Brad White, Brian Lubbers, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell from the BCI Cattle Chat Podcast team here at K-State. The BCI Cattle Chat Podcast is a weekly segment that goes up every Friday. You can find more from the BCI Cattle Chat team at ksubci.org. That will also be linked in the show notes of today's episode. So if you're listening on the radio, you can find us at agtoday.net with the link to their podcast as well. You can email the BCI Cattle Chat team any of your questions regarding what they cover, and their email is bci@ksu.edu. Their email can be found, again, in the show notes of today's podcast, which is at agtoday.net. Now we will continue on with this week's wildlife segment with Drew Ricketts. He is our wildlife extension specialist. And Drew, last time we talked with you, we covered bats in kind of a negative framework, I would say, but this week we're going to take a positive spin on it.
Yeah, that's right. So bats are one of those species that can cause folks problems, especially when they decide to get into a building, and that's what we talked about last time. This week I wanted to focus more on ecosystem services that bats can provide.
Before we get too far into that, we wanted to highlight some diversity in terms of species with bats.
That's right. So Kansas is home to about 15 different species of bats. Some different species of note are the gray bat, which is an endangered species, the northern long-eared bat, which is threatened and may be upgraded to endangered, the pallid bat, and Townsend's big-eared bat, which are both species that have been identified as in need of conservation in Kansas. All the bat species that are found in Kansas are insectivorous. We have no fruit bats, and we don't have any vampire bats.
Which is good to know because I feel like there's some fear associated with vampire bats.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that these bats are insectivorous, and you also mentioned that they provide an ecological service. So if listeners don't know what that means, can you describe that for us?
Sure. So ecosystem services can relate back to lots of different things, but when we're talking about a critter providing an ecosystem service, it's basically something that the critter does naturally that we would pay for if we had to do it ourselves. And so when we think about the ecosystem services that are provided by bats, they're eating species of insects that are also crop pests and vectors of human diseases and those sorts of things.
I know that there's some interesting studies that have been done regarding bats and these services that they provide. Can you explain a few of those for us?
Yeah, there are. One of the most notable studies that's a little bit older was published in the journal Science in 2011, and that study focused on trying to quantify the ecosystem services provided by Brazilian free-tailed bats, which nest in very large colonies, and they were looking at this in Texas, and they estimated that these Brazilian free-tailed bats provided about $74 per acre of cropland in pest species reduction. And that may be an overestimate, but even when we look at the most conservative estimates across the United States, they estimate that bats provide at least $4 billion annually in ecosystem services. And again, that's the crop pests that these species are consuming at night when birds and other things aren't available to consume those pest species.
A significant impact for sure. Who knew? So we've talked about a few of these species, but the two we referred to last week were ones that are commonly found in homes. But there's some studies that show that these are even beneficial too.
That's correct. So the big brown bat and the little brown bat are the two species that are most commonly going to be found in structures. And a brand new study published this year looked at through fecal DNA. So they took DNA from the feces that are deposited at the roosts of these different bat species and identified the species of prey that they were preying on. And they detected over 650 different species that those bats were preying on, and 160 of those were known agricultural pests or disease vectors.
Wow. So I know that you mentioned to me prior that between two of those species that are commonly found in homes, you mentioned that they kind of alternate in terms of when they're consuming mosquitoes specifically?
They do, yeah. So the little brown bat, earlier in the season, they're preying more on mosquitoes and flies that can be a pest species than the big brown bat are. And then later in the season, those species show up in the big brown bat diet. The other thing that's interesting about those two species is that 30% of the diet of the big brown bat in this study was found to be crop pests. Some of the notable species were corn rootworm, black cutworm, and a species of armyworm. So these are all species that producers in Kansas are thinking about probably relative to crop production.
Absolutely. Ones that make notable effects of damage as well. So
yeah, for sure. And that difference between the diets seasonally among those two different species sort of emphasizes the importance of diversity in the communities of wildlife that we see.
Absolutely. Well, Drew, we appreciate you as always for your time this week, and we thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
That was Drew Ricketts, our wildlife extension specialist here at K-State, covering bats, a more positive spin on them, and the ecological services that they can provide. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today. We are back now with another wheat harvest update for this season. And once again, we're going to have two different county agents with us speaking this week. But right now we have with us Jared Petersilie. He is a county extension agent for the Walnut Creek District in West Central Kansas. So Jared, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
First and foremost, what has your timeline been like in terms of harvest this year?
Harvest here went pretty quick. We largely wrapped up wheat harvest about a week ago. There were just a few small delays with 1000s, 2000s, little showers that go through, slowed everybody down, but as dry as we are, they disappeared quickly, and wheat harvest went pretty smoothly, but went pretty quickly as well.
Well, that's always good to hear. And then I know you said you wrapped up about a week ago, so in terms of yield and then quality data, what have you guys gotten back so far?
Yield is literally all over the board, much like you're going to find in most of Kansas. And when I say all over the board, I'm going to say 0 to 80. There were a select few fields that were in the high 70s, and like I say, one I know of that hit 80. All of the stars aligned, and it got there. But at the same time, we also had some untimely hail that went through, a streak that went through Ness and Rush counties. Wasn't very wide, but it didn't leave anything behind when it went through. And it was one of those late hailstorms that wheat was just a week from being cut, but that was pretty devastating for some of those guys. Hail is always devastating, but one of the things I looked at this year is what potentially could have been a 40, 45 bushel wheat harvest that now is decimated, and the difference between what that could have yielded and the insurance guarantee is steeper this year than what it would have been probably in years past.
Sure. And then in terms of quality, I know there's been a lot of variability in yield and, some disappointments here and there, but quality data for the most part, from what I've heard so far, has been fairly decent. Has that been the same for your counties?
Yes, very much so. Lots of wheat that was test weight was considerably over 60, and even those little showers that went through, we were still very stout in terms of that test weight. Quality in terms of protein, again, very much there's a range there based on fertility and nutrient that went into that wheat early on, but the dry weather and drought conditions sure helped bring that quality on, kept that quality up. So our protein is good, our test weights are good, and yields, I would say, actually probably surprised some guys with as dry as it has been. But there again, it seems to be very specific to where we've had those weather event, and I'm sure that we'll get into more weather-related events and comparing how those weather events match up with what the yields will actually be.
Let's go ahead and dive into that, because I know across the state we've had some weather variability. It's ranged really based on regions even, but you guys have had some unique weather events this year. What are some of the key ones? You mentioned hail earlier, but what are some of the others you've seen?
The one that I keep going back to is what I call the first snow. And far western Kansas, the Wallace County was probably the bullseye that ended up with almost 2 feet of snow. Being around producers at different events through the state, you can sure tell where that snowfall happened and what that helped in terms of the wheat yield. And to say that snow will help wheat yields goes without saying, but I think that our yield maps would be very correlated to what that snowfall was. Here in Rush County, we actually were on the edge of 4 different snows. So we had only minimal amounts of snow, couple inches, 3 inches at a time, but we did end up catching a pretty general rain, and that made a whale of a difference in terms of helping that wheat fill. But southern Ness County, southern Lane County in our district never caught much snow and didn't catch a lot of rain, and much like the rest of southwest Kansas, it just gets harder, drier, but those really far-reaching drought conditions to me kind of start in Ness County and then get worse as you go farther south and farther west. And the yields show that. In Rush County, there were a lot of wheat fields that were in the 40s and 50s. In Ness County, a lot of fields were in the 30s.
Continuing on, weather is always an issue, I feel like, when it comes to these harvest seasons. We're reflecting on the past and taking into account all that happened. But has there been any other issues that your producers have run into this harvest season?
Short wheat, and then the result of short wheat is you get the headers down, get under it, do what you can. I think that we're going to see some of those subsequent results then in the fact of there's not a lot of stubble. My grandfather would always say you're not going to break a drought during the summer. You got to have that snowfall and a winter that has the moisture to do that. There's a lot of truth to that, but those are those old standby sayings. Well, in order to hold that snow or keep that snow or protect that soil surface, that standing wheat stubble is key, and there are a number of places in our area that we're lacking that stubble, and I think that could pose some issues going forward with management in terms of weeds, management in terms of drought, you name it. Our wheat harvest went pretty quick with pretty dry weather. Now it's just one of those that what fields did pretty well. There was a lot of gaps in between in terms of some of those fields that didn't make it. And, we've had, looking back, 2016 was a really stout harvest, and we've had pretty stout harvests for the last 6 or 7 years. And this is one of those that, we kind of went back to an average year. So the co-ops don't have huge piles of grain. We're not piling grain outside. So you can sure see that there just isn't the volume of grain to work through like we've had or have become accustomed to at least in the last 5 or 6 years.
Jared, we just want to thank you again for your time. I know that this has been a busy last couple of weeks for most county agents in terms of harvest going on and things. So just thank you so much again for your time.
Sure. Enjoy it.
That was Jared Petersilie. He is a county extension agent for the Walnut Creek District, covering Lane, Ness, and Rush counties in west central Kansas. I've previously mentioned we're going to have 2 county extension agents, and now we have with us our second one. Her name is Sandra Wick, and she is a crop production agent for the Post Rock District. So, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Samantha. Glad to be here to share information.
Awesome. Well, first and foremost, let's start with where you guys are currently at in your harvest season. Have you guys wrapped things up, or is there still a bit more to be done?
Up here in north central Kansas, we are definitely on the downhill side with probably around 85 to 90% done around our district and around north central Kansas. There has been, a few interruptions with the rainfall, but we will definitely take the rain anytime this time of year.
Sure.
So we started around probably the 3rd week of June.
Well, that's good to hear. And then in terms of what has been harvested, have you guys gotten back any of that yield and quality data yet? And if so, what has it really shown?
Okay, yields are all over the board this year, from 20s even up to 70s, and that would be in the summer fallow ground.
Wow.
But the majority of our wheat is behind soybeans.
Mm-hmm.
So the yields are probably averaging in the 30s on those, on most of the wheat that's behind soybeans. But what I have heard is most producers have mentioned that is actually coming in better than they expected.
Good.
So that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's always a good thing to hear. And, 30s are not a bad yield. We've heard some pretty low ones in terms of variable data, especially some districts are so large now that you have producers in one county on the far side of the district that sell way lower than maybe people on the other opposite end of it. So the variability is definitely there. And then in terms of quality, what has that quality really looked like?
Quality, as far as the test weights, they were great prior to the rains. I mean, we're talking 60 to 64 pounds, but now, unfortunately, and that's what happens when we get some rains on the wheat crop, they're now probably 55 to 59. But the good thing is we really were very fortunate that we didn't have any diseases for the quality. We kind of had some towards the near end when the wheat was flowering. We had some cool rainy events. So we were afraid that we were going to have that Fusarium hep blight or the head scab. But as far as I know, I called around to some elevators. We haven't had hardly any wheat scab or head scab show up yet, and hopefully that will continue.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that's always good to hear. But when we're thinking about, some of these problems, disease being one of them, what problems have your producers really faced this year in terms of harvest and the growing season?
I think the biggest problem and challenge that they were concerned this year was simply lack of rainfall or the drought conditions. Mm-hmm. We were fortunate here in north central Kansas that we got some pretty good stands last fall. And I know in other parts of the state that did not happen because they just didn't get the moisture, and so they went into the winter and the fall with not very good stands. But we were fortunate we got stands here in north central Kansas. However, during that middle growing season, the rain kind of shut off. So we have some shorter, thinner wheat out there this year in some places, especially those fields that were behind soybeans. Now, if they were lucky enough to have some summer fallow, those fields did amazing. I mean, those are in the upper 60s to 70s, and then even some of the producers took advantage of those great commodity prices and even locked in some prices earlier.
Wow, awesome. Always good to hear. Well, Sandra, we thank you so much for your time. This has been a great update and probably one of our last ones. We'll probably have one more next week as harvest season really across the state is coming to a close. So we'll wrap up next week with Marcia Boswell from the Kansas Wheat Commission again. But Sandra, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Sandra Wick. She is a crop production agent for the Post Rock District for this week's wheat harvest for the 2022 season. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Tomatoes are by far the most popular garden crop. For central Kansas, mid-July is the typical harvest date. K-State Research and Extension horticulture agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says this growing season has been somewhat challenging. Greg, you were mentioning to me the fact that it's been kind of an up and down season for tomato growers, and I assume one of the problems has been the weather itself.
Yes, plants definitely are regulated by temperatures and their chemical reactions and how they grow and function. And so we've had hot weather, which sometimes is good, but sometimes not beneficial. And we've also had cool temperatures. As far as in my area, 58-degree low felt good. But for warm season crops like tomatoes, that's not necessarily good growing conditions. So we've really had ups and downs with our tomato crop in particular this year.
In terms of moisture, has that been good or bad?
In my area, it has been plentiful and haven't had to do any extra watering. And tomato, as they continue to grow and develop, do typically get a fairly deep root system. And so You may need to just probe the soil around your tomato plants before you turn that irrigation on and see if they really need moisture, because they're designed to get moisture out of the soil, and so we don't necessarily need to pamper warm season vegetables at all.
Now, fruit that was set before the heat wave arrived, that's fine, but what happened, I guess, maybe during that heat wave?
Yeah, so if we get temperatures typically above 95 degrees, which we've already had, that really doesn't allow for that pollen tube to grow and develop the fruit when it's blooming. And so those basically don't happen. And so we need to get cooler temperatures. And so you may, even though your tomatoes are blooming, they may not set fruit when it's extremely high. And also it gets too cool. And so 58 degrees really isn't conducive for that pollen growth as well. And so you may have a lull in your harvest come 30 or 40 days down the road, but you just need to hang in there because typically our weather conditions will be appropriate and give us some fruit eventually. But right now, there's been very little fruit set on a lot of our tomato plants, and so I just want to encourage you to hang in there.
And is that one of the reasons why we also encourage people to do some staggered plantings?
Yeah, that can, as far as their maturity dates and getting them to bloom. Tomatoes may not be needed to stagger as much as some of the other warm season or other crops, but if you find a healthy tomato plant, you definitely could still put that in the ground and get a harvest later in the season.
We also often see some disease problems about this time of the year. Anything popping up that you've seen so far?
So when we get into more mature tomato plants, they're doing a lot of things. They're blooming, they are setting their fruit, they're developing their fruit, and so there's usually less resources available for disease management. And so once you start to see some fruit developing and all those things are going on, then you're likely going to start to see some spotting of your lower leaves. And we have a couple different diseases that can blow in, storms and things like that, and you may start to see that develop. There are fungicides that you can apply to protect tissues. You could pick some of those leaves off. You want to get good air circulation. That's one of the main things. So maybe it's too late now, but if you planted and spaced your tomatoes farther apart, a lot of us here in Kansas like to use a cage around our tomato plant, and so we don't need to actually plant them in a row. We could space our tomatoes in the corners of the garden and get some good airflow around. But if you have lots of them, you may do a stake and weave or other system where you do have them in a row, so you don't get as good of airflow around the plants. And so removal of the leaf tissue, if you see spotting, black spots on the leaves, brown spots, you can remove those or use a fungicide. And it's typically when you get everything going on at the same time. And so if your tomatoes are getting to that stage, just be aware of it. There's a little bit of benefit by mulching our plants for disease pressure. You may still get some splashing of the spores up from the soil or from the lower leaves, and that's what we're looking at. But mulching's a good idea for weed management maybe and for moisture, but it may not do real well as far as disease management for us.
The real point here is don't give up, right?
That's right. You'll get some fruit. I almost can guarantee that, but depending on if you want a longer harvest, healthier plants, to get to that point, you may need to do some management as far as disease control.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with tips on caring for tomatoes. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.